This happened when I was 15 years old. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I wasn't old enough to get many on-the-books jobs, so I would occasionally babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and found an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. The post explained that she worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep before I arrived and would remain asleep most of the night. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like an easy job. I emailed the woman and got a response about an hour later. She asked for my phone number and called me that evening, and she sounded completely normal. She spoke calmly and answered all my questions. She explained that she had to leave for work before I would arrive, so she would hide a key outside the house. She told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before agreeing to anything. The woman spent several minutes speaking to my mom on the phone. Whatever they discussed seemed to satisfy my mom because afterward, she told me it sounded like a great idea. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by large trees. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed every light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked to the front porch and checked the hiding spot the woman had described. The key was exactly where she said it would be. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. After setting my backpack down, I turned around and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. Inside was a pretty standard house at first glance. There were family photos on the walls, and a few toys sat near the living room couch. I saw a pink backpack leaning against a chair. There were kids' drawings attached to the fridge with magnets. Everything seemed ordinary. Still, I wanted to know the layout of the house, so I walked through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway leading towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. What I was not expecting to see was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window looking out it, but that fact quickly made the sight more unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing to look at. I stared for several seconds before finally speaking. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was a smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth were missing. I asked who he was, and his smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed out of the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She answered after a few rings, and I explained that there was a man in one of the bedrooms. She sounded confused for a second before acting like she suddenly remembered. That part of it really still sticks with me. Then she explained that it was her brother who had dementia and sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he's harmless. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. If her brother was living there, he should have been mentioned in the ad or on our phone call. Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there for another minute just contemplating my situation. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing remained open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me nervous. I continued farther down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one. Locked. I tried the second one. Locked. The third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The room appeared empty. I couldn't see much because the lights were off. I pushed the door a little farther. It was just an empty room. Feeling stupid for being scared, I continued toward the guest room. As I passed the fridge again, I noticed something strange. The drawings attached to it looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of the drawings had dust sitting on top of the magnet holding it in place. The backpack I'd seen earlier looked faded too. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually been in that house was. The thought made me uncomfortable. I realized that despite being there for almost half an hour, I still hadn't seen a single sign that Rose currently lived there. I hadn't heard her, and I hadn't seen her room. I hadn't even seen any recent toys. I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a small room. I set my backpack on the floor. Then I noticed something. There was no lock on the door. As I turned around to look back into the hallway, there was the man again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He was looking at me again, and his smile came back on his face. I hadn't heard him approach. It was like he just teleported there. I honestly don't know how long he had been standing there. The missing tooth was visible even from where I stood. For several seconds, we stared each other down, me looking at him like he was some confused animal and not even an actual person. Then I quickly stepped inside the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm myself down. I knew well of dementia from a young age, as my great-grandmother passed away with dementia. This allowed me to justify this man's actions. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. I called my mom 3 times until she finally picked up. I told her of the situation I was in, from the unannounced brother with dementia to the fact that I couldn't even find the child in the house. For a few moments, she was silent. Then she told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing that made me feel relieved and scared at the same time. Scared because even my mom thought something was up here. She hung up after she said she'd be there as fast as possible. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer until they stopped directly outside the door. Everything went silent, and I stared at the doorknob. I checked my phone, and the woman still hadn't called back to see if everything was okay. I decided to call her myself, but after 3 attempts, she never picked up. While I was waiting, the bedroom door opened a few inches. I couldn't see who was standing outside. The opening wasn't wide enough. I sat there staring at it. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was on the other side didn't enter. I knew it had to be the brother. It was those final, tense seconds where I decided I was getting out of there, and I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I crossed to the other side and kept going. I ended up nearly a block away before finally slowing down. I pulled out my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, a text message appeared. It was from the woman's number. The message simply asked where I was going. I immediately looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside or at the windows. I didn't see any cameras when I entered the house, yet somehow she knew I had left. That was when I became convinced something was seriously wrong. I called my mom and told her not to come directly to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, she pulled up. I jumped inside and locked the door, and we left immediately. Neither of us ever contacted the woman again. I never figured out who the man really was. I never figured out if Rose actually existed. I never figured out why all the bedroom doors were locked. There's a slight possibility that it was all real and that I was just extremely paranoid and dipped out, but the chances of that are slim to none. Something weird was going on in that house.